Most people criticize capitalism for corruption, or greed, or inequality. But imagine discovering something stranger. Not a moral problem, a mathematical one. Imagine looking at the entire economic system and realizing something doesn't add up. Literally, imagine believing that the system is structured in a way where consumers will never quite have enough money to buy everything the economy produces. That's exactly what one man believed. His name was Clifford Hugh Douglas. And unlike most critics of capitalism, Douglas wasn't a politician. He wasn't a banker. And he wasn't even trained as an economist. He was an engineer. An engineer who believed the system itself was defective. Welcome to Capital Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing in the financial world is ever as simple as it looks. This is the story of the man who tried to hack capitalism with mathematics, and why his ideas still echo today in debates about inflation, debt, stimulus, and universal income. Because Douglas wasn't just criticizing capitalism, he was questioning the mechanics of the financial system itself. And when you question the mechanism, you start questioning the power behind it. To understand Douglas, we need to step back into the world that shaped him. He was born in 1879 in England, at the height of the British Empire. By the time he reached adulthood, the world had changed dramatically. Industrialization had transformed production. Factories could produce goods on a scale unimaginable just a century earlier. Railroads connected cities and nations. Global trade exploded. Industrial output soared. Humanity had discovered how to produce abundance, and yet, poverty never disappeared. Despite technological progress, despite mass production, despite global empires, millions of people still lived in fragile economic conditions. The early 1900s were full of labor strikes, unstable wages, and economic volatility. Then came World War I, a conflict that mobilized entire economies and demonstrated something extraordinary. Industrial society had the capacity to produce enormous wealth. But when the war ended, Europe was financially shattered. The machines were powerful. The system behind them was not. Douglas worked as a chief engineer in industrial companies, including aircraft manufacturing during the war. And while examining company accounts, he noticed something strange. Factories were producing goods efficiently. Production capacity was undeniable. But when he looked at the financial statements, something didn't seem to add up. Douglas observed that businesses recorded two broad categories of costs. First were payments made directly to individuals: wages, salaries, dividends. He called these A payments. Second were payments made to other organizations: interest paid to banks, capital depreciation, raw materials, overhead expenses. He called these B payments. Now here is where Douglas made his leap. He argued that only A payments entered consumers' pockets as purchasing power. But when companies priced their products for sale, those prices included both A and B costs. In other words, prices equaled A plus B, but consumer income equaled only A. And according to Douglas, this meant something radical. The economy was always producing more prices than purchasing power, even if factories ran perfectly, even if workers were efficient, even if goods were abundant. Consumers as a whole would never quite have enough income to buy everything being produced, unless they borrowed. In Douglas's view, the system had a chronic shortage of purchasing power. And that shortage created consequences. To keep goods moving off shelves, the economy had to rely on expanding credit. Consumers borrowed. Businesses borrowed. Governments borrowed. Or nations searched for export markets to sell their excess production. Sometimes they even entered wars that stimulated demand through government spending. Debt, Douglas believed, was not an accident. It was a structural necessity. Now remember the context. The world of the 1920s and 1930s was unstable. After World War I, the global economy experienced severe deflation. Then came the Great Depression in 1929. Factories had the ability to produce, but unemployment exploded. Machines sat idle. Goods existed, but people lacked the income to buy them. To Douglas, this wasn't a moral failure. It was a design flaw. He believed capitalism was incredibly efficient at producing abundance. The problem wasn't production, it was purchasing power. Douglas called his insight the A plus B theorem. And his solution was something he called social credit. Not socialism, not state control of industry, but a financial correction. He proposed two mechanisms. First, a national dividend. Every citizen would receive regular payments from the state. Not as welfare, not as charity, but as a rightful share of the nation's productive capacity. Because modern wealth, he argued, was not created by labor alone. It was also created by technology, knowledge, and generations of accumulated progress. Therefore, every citizen deserved a share of that inheritance. Second, Douglas proposed something called a compensated price system. Retail prices would be reduced through state-issued credit so that consumers could afford the goods being produced. In simple terms, production and purchasing power would finally match. Douglas believed banks created money as debt. He wanted credit creation tied to real productive capacity, not private lending decisions. He wasn't trying to destroy capitalism. He believed he was debugging it. His ideas gained attention during the Great Depression. In Britain, intellectual circles debated them. In Canada, they became a political movement. In 1935, the Social Credit Party won a landslide election in the Canadian province of Alberta. Suddenly, Douglas's ideas weren't theoretical anymore. They were political. And politics is where elegant equations collide with institutional power. The Alberta government attempted to implement reforms inspired by Douglas. But the federal government and the courts intervened. Many of the proposed laws were struck down. The banking system remained under federal control. The experiment failed. Mainstream economists were skeptical. Even John Maynard Keynes dismissed Douglas's theory as confused. Economists argued that B payments eventually become someone else's income. Money circulates through the economy. In the aggregate, income and output balance. And mathematically, they were largely correct. But Douglas wasn't focused on perfect accounting flowcharts. He was focused on control. Who creates credit? Who decides when money enters circulation? Who benefits from debt expansion? These were questions about money and power, and that's why Douglas still matters today. Many of the pressures he identified have not disappeared. Industrial economies produce vast quantities of goods. Technology accelerates productivity, but wage growth often lags behind. Household debt remains high. Governments frequently inject stimulus during downturns. Central banks expand their balance sheets during crises. In 2008, after the global financial crisis, trillions were injected into financial systems. In 2020, during the pandemic, governments sent direct payments to citizens. Stimulus checks, something that looked, at least superficially, like Douglas's national dividend. We don't call it social credit. We call it fiscal stimulus or emergency support. But the instinct is familiar. Inject purchasing power when demand collapses. Douglas believed the gap was permanent. Modern economists tend to treat it as cyclical. But one thing is clear. Modern economies are deeply dependent on credit expansion. When credit grows, economies expand. When credit tightens, recessions follow. Look at 2008. Years of expanding credit fueled consumption and asset prices. When credit markets froze, demand collapsed almost instantly. Was Douglas completely right? Not exactly. But he saw something many people miss. Modern economies rely heavily on credit to function. Douglas tried to solve poverty with mathematics, but what he really exposed was something deeper. Money is not just a neutral tool. It is a system of power. Credit determines who can invest, who can consume, who can accumulate wealth, and who remains permanently indebted. Douglas failed to rewrite capitalism, but he revealed something important. The system is not sacred. It can be analyzed, it can be questioned, and it can be redesigned. History doesn't repeat. But if you don't understand how money and power interact, it will outpace you. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe to Capital Historian. History has the answers, and we'll show you where to look.